Hello, I'm Mark Esper, former United States Secretary of Defense and the inaugural John S. McCain Distinguished Fellow at the McCain Institute for International Leadership here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. I am proud to welcome you to another installment of our program. Today, I'm honored to welcome a longtime friend and good ally of the United States, the current Minister for Defense and Deputy Prime Minister of Latvia, His Excellency, Minister Artis Pabriks. As we know, Latvia is an important United States ally in the Baltics, and Washington is an equally important and close partner of Riga. In fact, relations between the United States and Latvia are strong and getting stronger, especially these days. Indeed, this year marks the 100th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Latvia and the United States. In February 2020, the United States and Latvia signed a joint declaration on 5G security and agreed to hold regular consultations on cyber policy, cybersecurity, and critical infrastructure protection. Further, President Biden and President Levits met last year on the margins of the NATO summit in Brussels. It was there that President Biden underscored the United States' support for the security of Latvia, as well as the entire Baltic region. In December 2021, just last month, both presidents reaffirmed their commitment to working together through NATO to address the alliance's strategic challenges. As the immediate threat of Russian aggression in Ukraine once again looms large, we will discuss this matter over the next half hour, as well as Moscow's broader threat to its neighbors in Northern Europe. We will also talk about NATO, China, and other issues that may arise. We have the perfect guest today to help inform, enlighten, and guide us on these critical matters. Minister Pabriks has served in a variety of high-level political roles throughout his stellar career. Previously, he held positions as Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Defense, and was a member of the European Parliament. And as I already mentioned, the minister is a champion of the U.S.-Latvia partnership. He is someone that I enjoyed getting to know during my time as Secretary of Defense, and who I found to be a strong advocate for NATO. So it is my honor to welcome him here to discuss these many issues. Mr. Minister, Artis, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mark, and it's nice to see you again. In these screens would be much more happy to see personally in Washington or in Riga, but I cannot turn down a chance to work through McCain Institute because he was one of my favorite US politicians as well. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and let's talk.
Well, thank you, and thank you again for joining us. So I would like to start by asking you about Russian President Vladimir Putin's aggressive actions near Ukraine. It is probably the most significant strategic issue in the world right now, and certainly in Europe, is the massing of tens of thousands of troops, estimated to be above 100,000, along the border of Ukraine, coupled with some consistently tough talk coming out of Moscow. It is unclear what Vladimir Putin really wants and plans to do. Mr. Minister, what do you think?
Well, it's ironically, to answer, it's difficult to know what he's planning because I believe that maybe he didn't decide himself yet what to do. But looking from our perspective, and we have been and we are neighbors of Russia, and we follow up the Russian policies very, very deeply because our fundamental challenge and for security comes exactly from Russia. So my estimate would be that Putin and the closest circles around him are thinking that at this stage, the West is in general weakened. It was not responding with enough strength to the previous Russian challenges. The gas prices are high. Europe doesn't have a very strong leadership. And maybe this is a time to strike another advance. So the first advance, as we all can see, is against the Ukraine. But Ukraine is not the only thing on the mind of Kremlin at this moment, because I think that the longer perspective for Russian challenge to us at this stage is to disrupt in general a European and American relationship, to disrupt our transatlantic relationship, to divide Europe, to weaken and maybe disrupt NATO, and of course to get much more influence also in its closer and further neighborhood in the continent. And by approaching to this goal closer, Putin is taking into account his great advance in 2008, when he started the war against Georgia, 2014, when he annexed Crimea, when he basically put under control two regions of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, and of course, last year advance in Belarus, where Belarusian regime was on the brink of falling, and Putin assisted, of course, Belarusian President Lukashenko to stay in power. And we can consider, at least that's what we do here in the Baltic region in Latvia, to consider that Belarus ceased to exist as an independent country. It's a very close proxy at this stage to Kremlin, and it will work as an independent or semi-independent unit only so long until it is reasonable for Russians to keep it independent, and then it will be simply swallowed. And the very latest events also in Central Asia or Middle Asia regarding Kazakhstan, where I think Russians and Putin was using the instability in order also to create a longer and larger influence exactly in this region. So the empire is striking back. That's what we can see at this moment. And if we do not give the proper and right response to this, I would call it actually a brilliant tactical moves from the Kremlin side, then we might be actually advocating a longer tensions and also getting them a chance to prepare for the next advances. What we do here in our region, because of course every country and every society is judging situation based on their historic experience, on their presumptions, how things were working. And in our analysis, what's happening now is that Russians are very much willing to repeat something like Munich Agreement of 1938 or Nazi Communist Agreement of 1939, at least something in this regard, and trying to split the Allies.
So you raised a number of good issues, and I want to talk about some of them, such as NATO unity. But as you know, in the last 24 hours, President Biden seemed to make a distinction between what would be a minor incursion of Ukraine versus a major invasion, and it seemingly green-lighted some type of Russian advance into Ukraine. How do you read? Did you read that the same way in Latvia? And how does that change Putin's calculus, in your view?
Well, it's less important how we do read what American president told. It's important how Russians read that. And this is why we here in the region where Russians are close to us, we are used to read Russian minds. And Russians frequently see the Western politicians and Western decisions as a kind of weak if behind that doesn't stand the real naked force. Because if there is a naked force, if there is not a naked force, Russians will not tolerate you. They must be capable, to see not only carrot, but also stick. Now, what we get already from the Russian sources, that they are starting to discuss, okay, now, if there will be a different type of sanctions against our incursion or war against Ukraine, then we simply measure, we calculate how much we can afford in order not to provoke too much a stronger response. Mm-hmm. And from that perspective, I would say that this is a kind of sensitive tactics, because even if it is illogical looking from our side to tell that our response is adequate to any kind of attack from the Russian side, in practice, it could be comparable, maybe it's not politically correct, but I think it's a fine joke, to say that there is not a kind of a semi or partial pregnancy. Either you are pregnant or you're not. Either there is an attack or there is not. So that's the one thing. Another thing is, I really believe that Russians are great tacticians. Now, they understand that we as the West now have been putting all the our diplomatic forces and our messaging in the direction, if you will start the war, then we will act. But as we can see from Russian activities in Kazakhstan and Belarus, in obstructing different type of elections, in doing Stratcom in the Western societies, doing cyber attacks, they are increasingly operating in so-called gray area. So we should try to imagine what is a great area now vis-a-vis Ukraine from the Russian position. And my personal calculus would be that their great area is to get as much as possible without open war, while being at the same time ready for invasion. And what's that be? You know, we have this information coming now from also Russian Duma, so-called semi-parliament of Russia, where Communist Party is suggesting to recognize so-called Donetsk and Luhansk republics, which basically Russians dominate already now. At the same time, there is a very hard propaganda on Russian media going on by telling that so-called Ukrainian nationalists and extremists, they are planning a different type of plots against civilians in Donetsk and Luhansk, against different civilian installations, power connection lines, etc. So, at the same time, we sometimes speak that Russians are not predictable. They are very predictable. This plan is the plan we have been going through, and Finland, for instance, was going through in 1939. So first, they recognize the republics, then these republics tell us that they are threatened, then Russian troops are moving in. To move Russian troops in Donetsk and Luhansk, you don't need war, because they will open-handedly, with flowers, they will just receive them. So the question is, what do we do? What kind of sanctions do we do? Do we have sanctions? My answer is that probably some of Western politicians in Europe, particularly, will be a bit confused about this because they wanted to avoid the war. They did not get the war. So I think this is exactly what plays in Putin's hands, because our reaction will be divided. Anything where we are divided is good for him.
I think you're certainly right about the Russian predictability. You and I both grew up during the Cold War. I of course, served in the United States military, and
I served in Russian military.
Served in very good. Served in Europe as well myself. But the other factor, of course, is other factors that are critical here in dealing with the Russians, the Soviets before them, is American leadership and NATO unity. And you mentioned that up front. To me, that is a big question as well. Where is NATO unity right now? There are concerns that the French and Germans aren't on board. Speak to us about that, because that obviously is a big factor in Putin's calculus as well.
Good. We trust our allies. And up to now, the American position, Pentagon position, your State Department position was extremely friendly and positive, because they declined any attempts of Russians to speak about us without us. So that is exactly that precedent what they always would like to attempt, like it was also in last century during the Second World War, so on. So from that position, we do not feel excluded, we feel included. And I think also I speak not only about Latvia here, I speak about Poles or Finns or Estonians, and I speak about our possibility to be in touch with United States officials, with NATO officials. Jens Stoltenberg, he's a great guy. His presentation of NATO position when there were 2 weeks ago meeting between Russians and NATO in NATO-Russia Council, I think it was a great position. But while saying all these positive things, and by actually confirming that at this moment we seem very united, we cannot exclude that Russian tactics will continue to divide opinion on different type of details. So, for instance, one of the issues where we are concerned is the issue which is also actual in this dialogue, namely military maneuvers and exercises. So it would be logical from our side to tell, all right, if we want to decrease the tension, let's put some kind of a restriction for military exercises, etc., either voluntarily or agreed upon on both sides. But here you must understand, and I think also participants of this dialogue from the Western countries must understand that, sorry to say, Russians are following different logics. Their diplomacy is not a Western diplomacy. When we are speaking with Chinese, when we are speaking with Asian countries, we automatically assume that they are behaving in a different way, they have a different perspective, they have a different interpretation, the different wording. And our mistake frequently is, Western mistake, that once we are in negotiations or in dialogue with Russians, we automatically assume that they are doing this with the same principles and attitude like we do. It's not like this. They are not in that sense European country. They have a different logic. And what we are a little bit afraid that once we start, and if we get involved in this mud of nitty-gritty issues, what Russians are proposing in their ultimatum, then we somewhere could commit a mistake. So this is why we say, and I would say, yes, we do trust. Yes, we always trusted, but we have to check, and we would be extremely happy if we always also in future would be informed about any kind of details before giving any kind of answer to Russians, because maybe sometimes our hundreds of years of experience living next to them could be beneficial also for negotiators.
Well, you touched on the next issue I wanted to discuss, and that was the press reports here in the United States that the Biden administration told the Russians it was willing to scale back military deployments and exercises if the Russians reciprocated. And in my view, that was an error. I was proud that in 2020 we had the largest deployment of U.S. forces to Europe since the 1980s, I believe, and I thought it was great in terms of reassuring our allies and also deterring the Russians. But can you elaborate more on that? And were the NATO allies notified beforehand that things like that would be put on the table?
Well, our position, which is like non-NATO countries, Sweden and Finland, and NATO countries like Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Poland, for instance, for us, this proposal from the Russian side is simply bluntly unacceptable. Because it's a kind of, sorry to say, spitting in the face, because what they are in fact telling, that, look, we, first of all, do not recognize at all anybody who joined NATO after 1997. And if you follow the speech of Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, once he was speaking about us, he was telling these orphaned territories was taken over by NATO. So this wording, first of all, orphaned. So they were not orphaned. They were previously occupied by Soviet Union. Secondly, he even avoided to mention our countries by name. He was calling it territories. That's a very significant diplomatic move, which have to be recognized. And I think on the Twitter, former Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski very correctly told that, you raped us once, second time we will hit you back if you will try to do something like this. So that's the only possibility, because if we would even imagine to accept such type of Russian proposal, what they gave to us, that basically would mean that we open our borders, we disarm our armies, we do not buy any new equipment, and we basically stay open up to the place where Germany starts for Russians to move in. So that's simply impossible. They also were suggesting, for instance, exercises and maneuvers only at one brigade level. I mean, my country has 5 brigades. So what shouldn't I even make an exercises? I would not be afforded, and I would not be able anymore to buy HIMARS from America or some other country, rocket artillery, because they would object to this. They would object to air defense, coastal defense, anything what normal country would simply agree upon. And in fact, that would be crazy if NATO would agree on this, because then we know Finland, which has been fighting a very, very fierce and strong war in 1939 against Soviets. They are not in NATO because they have a 900,000 reserve for 5 million population country. They are purchasing F-35s and missiles. So my question would be, look, I joined NATO in order to disarm, when Finland, by not being in NATO, can arm. We simply cannot afford this. So, and the funny part is that where it's a bit of mystery, that Russians know that. They know that answer will be no. So if they know this, why do they put themselves in this corner? Because to retreat from this, it's extremely difficult. So I don't have a very clear answer. What is a mindset now? Because to put yourself in the corner without possibility to retreat, that basically just escalates the situation.
And that's why I ask about these proposals. Another question along these same lines. You announced at the beginning of the year that Latvia was providing military weapons and training to Ukraine. And you said, I think very importantly, quote, Ukraine is fighting our war. And you call on your neighbors and allies to do the same. I know what that means. Many of our viewers know what that means. But can you elaborate a little bit more in terms of our war?
Ukraine is not NATO ally, but it is our ally in general. And the thing is that Russia is pursuing the revanchist policies already for more than a decade, at least. Now, I will not recount anymore all the acquisitions of territories and influences, but Ukraine, or let's put it like this, they probably will not move against any other neighboring country until they will not fully control Ukraine. Because Ukraine is a big piece of land which is strong enough and ready to stand. Now, they need to neutralize this country in order to have any further ambitions. This is our assumption. So until Ukrainians stand, until Ukraine is an independent country, we feel much more secure. Just like we felt much more secure until Belarus was still a country. Because at this moment, when Russian troops are moving into the Belarus and they are controlling basically airspace and Belarusian borders and an army, also possibilities for conflict against us in the Baltics, which are bordering Belarus, is much more closer because the timing is shorter. Shorter notice attack is possible because Belarus is under the Russian control. Mm-hmm. So from that perspective, I have been, and we in this region, all around the Baltic Sea, in the Northern Europe, we have been pledging all the time our partners in America and particularly in Europe, please invest more in Ukraine. Invest not only in Ukrainian defense, but invest in their government reforms, invest in their economy, work with them. And this is what we are doing because we are sending their humanitarian assistance. We are now trying to push European Union as an organization to send a military education exercise under the European Union flag where we would participate to train Ukrainians. And there are a number of other things. We have been establishing capellan service in their army. We have been giving a lot of nice assistance to their refugees and civilians from Luhansk and Donetsk. So we understand that if we will be in danger, if Ukraine even is not a NATO country, there is a very high probability they will send us assistance as well.
So what do you think NATO or the United States could do, should do right now to prevent an invasion of Ukraine? What would be the 1, 2, or 3 things? Maybe it's material support, weapons support, political support. What could we do now to stop or to deter a Russian invasion?
Well, first of all, we don't need to blink whenever Russians are threatening us. Because if you are a boxer, if you're a karateka, you know, if you want to go to dojo or somewhere else, if you enter that space, you must accept that you might be hit. But the opponent also knows that, so he's much more careful. So we must tell that we don't want war. Nobody wants war. War is bad thing. But at the same time, we should also tell, look, dear Putin, I mean, if you want war, you can get it. We are not afraid of that. And we will not allow you to go forward. That's one thing. Secondly, I think that we should not only give military and humanitarian assistance and civil assistance to Ukraine from our side. This is what United States is doing, Great Britain is doing, what Baltic states and Poland is doing actually. But we should try also to convince our European partners to be more engaged in this, because we know that the largest country in Europe, Germany, which after the Second War is pacified very much, they still cannot change their mindset about security perspective, about increase of spending of military, about capabilities, about deployment of forces, about assistance to Ukraine. We have to work with these partners because European security and real capabilities, I cannot imagine without active role of Germany. But Germans are hesitant. They are, Nord Stream 2, all the business works with Russia. So one thing is that in the words many Europeans tell, yes, we are solidar with other countries, but if you are just talking and if you do not have those real capabilities, then it's much more difficult. We have to reform Ukraine. So we must make it a more or less a normal European country. This is a long work. It's not easy. There are different societies. We don't meet exactly those expectations that from other countries, but this is the only way. Increase our influence over there, also in Central Asia. And what is highly important, what I would like to say to Americans also, I think, we did not touch upon this up to now, I think it's very important to try to get a better relationship with such country as Turkey. Turkey is a crucial player. Turks know how to look into the eyes of Russians. Turks are supporting Ukraine. Turks are friendly to us also here in the Northern Europe. They have been very important for Caucasian region. Turkey matters, no matter do we like, some personal attitudes or not.
Look, you raise a number of good points, and I agree with them. I think, when you and I served together as defense ministers in NATO, we had our share of issues with Turkey, but I agree that I think it's a valuable partner that we need to bring closer back into our orbit. And your point about Germany as well, I recall, again, during my time in the service, that West Germany felt very differently and had a different perspective on Russia when the Soviet Union was on their border. So a lot of it depends on your proximity to the problem, and that's a challenge. And you could say the same with regard to France as well. Key countries that we need on board with NATO. But assuming the worst happens, right, and Ukraine is invaded, how do you think NATO will respond?
Well, first of all, the continuous and increased assistance to Ukraine with weapons, with food, with all the materials what is needed. Secondly, a very, very strong sanctions, which can hit Russia economically, financially. Thirdly, immediate deployment of additional troops to Poland and Baltic countries, and additional also financial and military assistance to us, because we need equipment, we need goods, we need also to increase the readiness of our armies, and we are missing that because we are small countries and our budgets are not so large that we can afford, for instance, ourselves to purchase or to buy such things as Patriots or something in that sense. So we will increase our military budget ourselves when such thing happens, but we still rely on United States assistance. And I must say that for your taxpayers, this money would be extremely well spent. That's number one. Number two, that money, taking into account our size, is not a huge amount. It's much smaller than you would probably give to some other countries. And at the same time, you will get much more security, because we are ardent supporters of democracy, of independence, and we are, I would say, the same words you told about myself, I would say about our countries here in the region. We are the best supporters of American interest in Europe. You need us here also in European continent.
I certainly found that during the times that I've visited the Baltic states. It's certainly true. And getting to some of the broader points you mentioned, during my tenure, I argued for the alliance to focus more on European security, for members to live up to their spending commitments, and for allies to enhance their readiness as part of the NATO Readiness Initiative. And of course, you and I talked beforehand, I also wanted to push more United States forces east toward Russia. But what is your assessment of NATO right now? Is it where it needs to be to stand down the Russians with regard to its readiness and preparedness?
I think we are moving in the right direction. The most important part for NATO is that every and each member is seriously working on their own capabilities. And as far as it is the deployment and time of action, for us as a border countries, the most important issue is that NATO can react fast. In our case, it's not about readiness in 30 days. It's not about readiness in 10 days. It's about NATO readiness in 24 hours. Yes. So that is our perspective. And this is where we still need additional efforts.
I completely agree with you. That's That's why I believe so much in the NATO readiness initiative, because you're right. It takes time for American forces to deploy and arrive in mass, enough to do something. So it's critical that we have that readiness. And again, as far forward as possible. And you and I discussed, I know Latvia would be interested in the permanent stationing of American troops there, as would your Baltic partners as well. You've talked a little bit about it. And before we pivot to China, you may want to elaborate, but you're concerned about Belarus as well.
Yes, I mentioned already that Belarus ceased to exist as an independent country, but at this moment, the days of independent Belarus are counted. Lukashenko will be used only as long as Russia needs him to act as semi-independent political puppet. Whenever it will not be needed, then either he will be replaced by some, I don't know, governor or something else, or Belarus simply will be integrated fully into the existing Russia. So that's a perspective in our understanding. So by such type of military and political integration, of course, the Suwalki Gap, which is dividing Poland and Lithuania, is becoming a more urgent issue, along with all those Russian troops which are stationed nearby us in the former Königsberg region, now Kaliningrad, which is a Baltic Sea area, because the biggest danger what we could face in event of crisis is that they might cut away us from the rest. And your support to us would be simply hindered for too long time. So what we are working on this, we are of course bolstering our security forces and defense forces in a way that any kind of attack could be deterred by simply telling, look, just like in 1939 with Finland, yes, you are bigger, yes, you are stronger, yes, eventually, if we are just two of us, you might win us, but that will be extremely costly for us, for you. So that's what Russians should calculate, and I think they will calculate that. So, and Belarus here is simply a great gate for such kind of offense, but until Ukraine stands, we feel still a little bit easier.
Well, thank you for elaborating on that. Now, let me pivot to another authoritarian state, China. I'm sure it seems far more distant today than it maybe did 6 weeks ago. But talk to us about Latvian-Chinese relations, and how does China impact your security?
Well, we were learning in our relationships through the hard way, because once we regained our independence from Soviet Empire in the early 90s, then we have been one of the countries which started our diplomatic relationship with Taiwan and not with communist China, because in those days, you know, we were under the impression of our independence movements, and we simply were looking really where values are, and which is a similar mindset. We paid very dearly for that, and after the middle of 90s, of course, we turned down this relationship in those days with Taiwan, and we do not challenge at this moment one China policy. This is also what I told to Chinese government at this stage, that you know, we will not challenge one China policy. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we are not worried about what is happening in Pacific. We see that China is becoming increasingly assertive in the region, and Taiwan, of course, is a weak spot. So we cannot afford that something is brewing up or war is going on in the Pacific between United States and China. So we very much support the increased cooperation between United States and Japan, Australia, New Zealand. I think it's important also to mention such countries as Singapore, Vietnam, Philippines, South Korea. And looking from the Latvian perspective, I believe that if there is a space and place where United States would like to work with us together in some kind of exercises also in Pacific, we are ready to deploy some of our people over there. We do not have such a navy which we could send to Pacific, of course, but I know that you cooperate with a number of countries there, and we are ready, because we have also a very good partnership with such countries as Japan, for instance, and also Australia and New Zealand. So we understand the concern, We see that China and Russia is extending hand to each other. We still think that this is tactical because Russia is here the smallest brother. They probably would not trust very much China anyway, because they know the power of China, the rising power of China. But looking from our perspective here, what we would be worried about is that if tensions increase in Pacific, Russians will use this in Europe against us, because they will assume that United States will be too extending their lines of defense, that you will not be able to act in both places at the same time. So that basically means that we here are extremely interested that Pacific is staying calm. Because if it's not staying calm, we can expect also increased dangers at our borders. And that is a big worry. And this is what United States Congress, Senate, and government and Pentagon should take into account. If your presence will not be here, if your allies will not be strengthened, if something happens in Pacific, Europe is in danger as well.
Well, first of all, thank you for the offer with regard to assisting in the Pacific. I hope the administration would take you up on that. But you do make an important point I wanted to pull the thread on, and that is the relationship between China and Russia. And, in my view, the administration's message to Germany months ago that it would not sanction Nord Stream 2, while that may have been received positively by the Germans, the Russians, of course, were watching and took a different message. And one could argue that has led to a series of events that we are where we are now. But just the same, China now is watching what happens in Eastern Europe with Ukraine. And they will be determining the strength of this administration, the unity of Europe, the cohesiveness and readiness of NATO, all these things that will be assessed. And it has seemed strange to me that on one hand, this partnership does appear very tactical between Moscow and Beijing, because one might argue it's only a matter of time before Russia becomes a client state or a subservient state to China in the big scheme of things. Any further thoughts on that in terms of what we should watch with regard to the relationship between China and Russia?
You are 100% correct, because Putin is now sending ultimatums to the West simply because our answers to advances in Syria, with crossing red lines as far as chemical weapons, in Georgia, in Crimea, were not firm enough. If we do not stand firm enough now with Ukraine, that will be interpreted equally by Russians and by Chinese, and they will be interpreted correctly that we are not serious and we are not strong enough. And weakness is not tolerated by authoritarian regimes. If you are weak, you'll be crushed.
Yeah, it's China certainly doesn't pretend not to be a communist country. Putin behaves as an autocrat and he has democratic processes, but for all intents and purposes, they behave the same on the world stage. And what has concerned all of us, as you recall from our discussions at Nato, was they're just upsetting the international rules and norms and misbehaving around the world, both countries. And now is what we're seeing in Ukraine is the most recent and the most dangerous one we've seen in quite some time. And arguably, we could see the greatest conflict in Europe since the end of World War II, which of course concerns all of us. And for the United States and its partners in the Indo-Pacific, we're much concerned about what could happen in Taiwan or the South China Sea, where, of course, the authoritarian state led by Xi Jinping has similar aspirations to expand its control over other parts of the world, and if not its sovereignty, its suzerainty over much of Asia, and eventually the globe. So these are important things for us to watch. And it was interesting to see several weeks ago your Baltic ally neighbor Lithuania to stand up to Beijing on the matter of Taiwan. And some statement was made. We know what it's like to be a small country next to a big one that has hegemonic aspirations. So it's great to see smaller countries like yourself and Lithuania standing up to these big bullies.
Well, I think Lithuanians in this case simply remembered that more than 30 years ago, when we regained our independence, the first country which recognized our independence was Iceland. So as one of the Icelandic prime ministers told, big countries have geostrategic concerns, small countries have moral concerns.
Very well put and very well said. So thank you. Minister Pabriks, as we wrap up, I'd like to get your thoughts on the future of the U.S.-Latvia bilateral relationship. Where is it going? What do you hope for it to look like in the years ahead? Can you give us your final thoughts?
Well, we have a very, very long history of very, very good relationship, because it's before the Second World War, it's during the Cold War where you were standing for us. I remember my times when I was a kid, every evening listening American Voice and listening American Voice in Latvian, and it actually kept our liberty values and freedoms alive, in fact. And this is why such radio stations like American Voice or Radio Free Europe or any other are highly important for societies which are under the occupation or joke or anybody else's rule. Now, as far as the future, I mean, there's always time for intensifying it. And I think where we are looking forward is not only a military cooperation, because I think we are looking forward for additional investments. We are looking forward for additional trade, anything what we can do with Americans. And also we are interested, of course, in American presence in European continent. That means that being a member of European Union, we can always assist to shape also whole European trade negotiations, any other things where issues run between Europeans and Americans, because we here in the Northern Europe, actually, we are the closest part to United States. So looking from my direct responsibility, I would encourage very much Pentagon and your military enterprises to look for partners in my country, because I was announcing this year in Latvia as a year of military industry. So it's one thing to buy and sell. Another thing is that we can find some coupling and to do things here, because COVID infection, it showed that lines of provision, logistics matters. And we cannot always think that, if we buy something from United States and we need some repairment or something, we can send it back to United States. We will never get it again. So I think, and for you again, it is a good opportunity to extend also your business and your footprint here in the northern region, because we are small but vital countries with a good knowledge of languages, and we know our neighbors.
Well, very good points. And thank you again, Artis, for joining us in our discussion today. Your answers and comments were very thoughtful, insightful, and strategic, just as we expected. And I also want to thank you, the audience, for tuning in to the fifth in a series of conversations I've had with global leaders about the challenges and opportunities the United States and its allies and its partners face today and in the future. And lastly, please follow the McCain Institute on Instagram and Twitter for updates and for future events. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, McCain Institute. You're doing a good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Minister.